Come stand with me a minute. It's early September. One of those mornings where the dew hasn't lifted yet, and the grass, what's left of it, is cool and damp against your shoes. You've got a cup of coffee going lukewarm in your hand, and you're looking out at a lawn that's more dandelion and clover than green. And somewhere in the garage, there's a bag of grass seed waiting. $60, give or take. Maybe you bought it last weekend. Maybe it's still sitting in a cart on your computer. And this Saturday, you were finally going to spread it and fix all of this. My friends, before you do, set the bag down. Just for the length of this little talk, because I have watched good, careful people, folks who did everything by the book, spread that seed, water it faithfully for 3 weeks, and end up with the very same weedy lawn they started with, minus the $60. And it always stung to see, because it was never their fault. It came down to 2 small things nobody had ever told them. One costs you nothing to check. The other costs about $2 to fix, and nearly everyone skips it without even knowing it's there. Now, I've had my hands in the dirt for a long time, longer than I sometimes care to admit. And if there's one thing all those seasons taught me, it's this. The lawn is almost never the problem you think it is. So let me walk you through it, slow and easy, the way I wish someone had walked me through it 40 years ago. And by the end, you'll know the right order to do things in, and that little $2 step that quietly saves the whole thing. Let's start with a question. When you look out at all those weeds, what do you see? Most folks see an enemy, an invasion, something that came and beat their grass in a fair fight. But here's the thing, and I want you to sit with it for a second, because it changes everything that comes after. Weeds are not the disease. They're the symptom. Think about how a weed actually gets into a lawn. A seed drifts in on the wind, or off a bird, and lands on the ground. For that seed to wake up and grow, it needs one thing more than anything else. It needs light touching bare soil. Now picture a thick, healthy patch of grass. That weed seed lands on a dense mat of blades, and it never reaches the dirt, never feels the sun, and it just sits there and gives up. Weeds don't move into a full house. They move into the empty rooms. So when you look at a lawn that's gone mostly to weeds, what you're really looking at is a lawn where the good grass thinned out first, and the weeds simply moved into the space it left behind. They didn't win a battle. They found a door standing open. And that, my friends, is the whole secret hiding in plain sight, because it means killing the weeds, all by itself, gets you almost nowhere. Spray everything down to bare dirt and don't fix the thinness, and you've made the single most weed-friendly surface on God's green earth. One season later, you're right back where you started. Only now you've spent money too. So yes, seed is the answer. Grass thick enough to close those doors, but only in the right order. And that's exactly where it falls apart for most people. So let me tell you why your last try may have failed. And I promise you, for a lot of you, this is going to land like a little bell going off. Have you ever put down seed, watered it, waited, done everything right, and had absolutely nothing come up? Not a single blade? And you figured, well, the seed was junk, or the soil's no good, or you're just not blessed with a green thumb. Let me tell you what most likely happened. And I'll warn you now. It's a quiet heartbreak, this one. There's a kind of product that goes by names like crabgrass preventer. It's tucked inside most bags labeled weed and feed, too. The folks in the trade call it a pre-emergent. And here's how it works. It lays down an invisible barrier in the top of the soil, and it stops seeds from ever getting going. It reaches out and stops that very first tiny root a seed sends down, before anything ever breaks the surface. And here's the part that catches people. It cannot tell the difference between a weed seed and your good grass seed. To that barrier, a seed is a seed. It stops them all. So picture the sequence that plays out in yard after yard, spring after spring. In April, you do the responsible thing and put down crabgrass preventer. You're being a good steward. Then a couple months on, you look at the lawn, decide it could use thickening, and you spread your grass seed, and nothing comes. But here's the tender part. The seed wasn't bad. It did its job. It swelled, it woke up, it pushed out its first little root reaching for the soil. And that root met the barrier you laid down months before, and it died down there in the dark before it ever saw the light. You paid for weed prevention, and it worked. It worked perfectly. It just also worked on the one thing you were hoping to grow. Now, I don't tell you this to make you feel foolish. Heaven knows I've made every mistake in the book twice. I tell you because it's the first thing to check, and it costs nothing. Before you do another thing, go out to the garage and read the bags, read the labels. Anything that says it stops weeds before they start, that's a pre-emergent, working down at the seed level. And plenty of good people have used weed and feed for years and never once knew there was one in it. Now, the old rule of thumb you'll hear is that the barrier fades in about 12 weeks. And for some products, that's roughly true. But I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing I've got worth giving. Some of the most common preventers, the strong, long-lasting ones you'll find on the shelf, can hold in the soil for 4, 5, even 6 months, especially where the weather runs cool. Travis Gannon, a professor over at North Carolina State who spends his days studying exactly how these things behave in the ground, will tell you the same. So don't set your seeding date by the calendar, and don't set it by your enthusiasm. Set it by that bag. If a preventer went down this spring, your best move is usually to wait and seed in the fall, when it's long gone. And here's a gentle little aside, just between us. If you've been following along on this channel, you know I'm fond of the natural way of doing things. Corn gluten meal, that golden powder we've talked about, does a little of this same pre-emergent work all on its own, which is a fine thing, until the week you want new grass to come up. Even the gentle helpers play by the same rule. A seed is a seed, so mark your calendar and give it its space. All right, there's a cousin to that problem worth naming, because it catches folks in a different way. The preventers we just talked about stop weeds before they sprout. But there's another kind you spray on weeds that are already up and growing. The ones that take out dandelions and clover without hurting your grass. Useful things, truly, and often the right first step on a weedy lawn. But they linger too. As a rule, you want to give it somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 weeks between spraying and putting down seed, and always check that particular label. And here's the squeeze that catches people. If you spray too late in the season, by the time the waiting's done, you've missed the fall seeding window altogether, and you're sitting out a whole year. So the timing isn't a small detail. The timing is the whole game. Now, here we are. This is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The $2 step. The one almost nobody knows exists. And I'd wager it's the reason more good reseeding jobs fail than any other single thing. So lean in a little. When we go to seed a thin patch or a bare spot, what's the natural thing to do? We spread a little something over the seed to tuck it in. Keep it in touch with the ground. Hold the moisture. Stop the birds from making off with it. Sensible. So off we go to the garden center. We grab a bag of topsoil. We spread it over the top, and we call it done. And I did this for years myself. Years. And that bag of cheap dirt is very often full of weed seeds. Read that again in your mind, because it explains a heartache I've watched play out 100 times. You fought weeds all spring. You finally got your seed down. And 6 weeks later, that very patch is thick with new weeds. Sometimes kinds you've never even seen in your yard before. And you think, I failed again. But you didn't fail, my friend. You planted them. You carried them in yourself, in the very dirt you used to cover your seed. Now let me be fair and careful here, because I don't ever want to overstate a thing to you. It isn't every bag of topsoil, and it isn't all bad. Clean topsoil from a good, reputable source can be just fine. The real troublemakers are the cheap, recycled garden soils and the bagged composts that were never heated up enough to kill the weed seed inside them. That's where the trouble rides in. So the fix is small, and it's cheap, and it changes everything. Cover your seed with something that carries no weed seed to begin with. A light dusting of peat moss, or its kinder cousin, coconut coir. These are the same clean, humble materials folks use to start seeds indoors on the windowsill. Peat moss forms slow, down in the still, acid water of a bog, and because of how it's made, it just doesn't carry viable weed seed. A small bag runs you a couple of dollars and covers plenty. Now, I'll be straight with you about peat, the way a friend should. When it dries out all the way, it turns stubborn and sheds water instead of soaking it up, so you've got to keep it damp. And if it sits right with your conscience to be gentle on the earth, coir does the same good work without draining a bog to get it. Either one, you're planting grass, and only grass. And here's the deeper truth underneath the $2 step, the thing the old-timers knew. You may not need to cover it at all. What your seed truly wants isn't a blanket. It wants to touch soil, bare, honest contact with the ground. A good raking to work it in does the very same job, for free. If you cover, cover clean. But never bury your seed in trouble. Now let me tell you a little story, because this $2 step has a grandfather, and I think you'll like him. Back in 1868, in a small town called Marysville, Ohio, a man named Orlando Scott came home from the Civil War and opened up a little shop. And by every account I've read, he could not abide a weed, hated them, truly, with a passion. Back in those days, the seed a farmer bought was a gamble. Half of what you sowed might come up as weeds you never asked for, so Orlando set to work. He learned to sort the weed seed out of the good seed, by hand, grain by grain, until what he sold was better than 99% clean. Farmers paid a little more for it, and they came back, every year, because a clean field is worth more than a cheap bag. And here's the part that gives me chills, even now. That stubborn old habit, that white-hot care about a seed being clean, is the very reason your bag of grass seed today has a little line on the label telling you exactly how much weed seed is inside. One man's quarrel with weeds, more than 150 years ago, printed right there on your bag. So when I tell you to read the label, know that you're reading his life's work. And read it you should. On the back of a good bag, you'll find the purity, the amount of other crop seed, and the weed seed. And on a quality mix, that weed number will be very, very small. The cheap blends are cheap for a reason, and they'll often be padded out with annual ryegrass, which comes up fast and green and beautiful, and then dies off, which is why the lawn looks grand for 6 weeks and goes thin again. And one more thing folks never think to check: the date on the bag. Seed is a living thing. It's perishable, like anything else. A bag that spent a hot summer and a cold winter baking in the shed can come up far weaker than the label promises. Buy it fresh, buy it close to when you'll use it, and keep what's left somewhere cool and dry, not in a sweltering garage. Now let's talk about the ground itself, because this is the fourth thing that quietly ruins good work. Have you ever wondered why some seed just seems to vanish? Here's why. A seed cannot sprout sitting on top of hard, packed dirt or on a thick layer of old dead thatch. It has to reach down and touch real soil. And most lawns that have gone weedy have gone hard underneath, packed down tight from years of walking and mowing and weather. There's a test that costs you nothing. Take a long screwdriver and push it into the soil. In good, breathing ground, it slides down several inches without much fuss. If it stops dead after an inch or two, well, there's your answer. You're packed down tight, and seed spread on that surface is mostly feeding the birds. The kindest thing you can do for packed ground is core aeration. The kind that actually pulls little plugs of soil out, not the spiky shoes that only press the hardness deeper. And here's a lovely bonus, one of my favorite tricks. Aerating right before you seed leaves the ground dotted with thousands of little holes, and each one is a perfect little cradle. The seed falls in, it's held, it's touching soil, it's shaded from drying out. Aerate and seed on the very same day, and you've done one of the highest return things there is in all of lawn care. Now, I promised you honesty, and I want to give you one real exception to that whole pre-emergent rule, because it's a good tool and it solves the timing squeeze. There is one preventer. The active ingredient is called mesotrione, and you'll see it under names like tenacity. That's clever in a very particular way. It'll hold back crabgrass and clover while still letting your good grass seed come up. You can put it down right when you seed, but I have to give you the caveats, because that's what a friend does. It doesn't last long. Only about 3 or 4 weeks, so you'll likely need to reapply it. It plays nicely with the cool season grasses, your fescues and bluegrass and ryegrass, but it can injure some of the warm season southern grasses, like St. Augustine. So if that's what you're growing, read the label close before you reach for it, and when in doubt, ask your local extension office. Used with care, it's the thing that lets you prevent weeds and seed in the very same season, instead of choosing one. Now, before you rush out, let me tell you which weeds make you wait, because I don't want to send you seeding into a spot where it simply cannot work. There are 3 cases where you deal with the weeds first. The first is the heavy creeping kinds. Ground ivy, which many of us grew up calling creeping Charlie, along with nutsedge and bindweed. These don't just crowd your seedlings, they smother them, growing a mat right over the top of anything trying to rise. The second is a thick, matted stand of crabgrass. Now here's a kind thing to know about crabgrass. It's an annual, so the first hard cold kills it on its own. But if it's grown into a heavy mat, that dead thatch blocks your seed from the soil. so it has to come out. A good raking or a low scalping does it. And the third is a heavy carpet of broadleaf weeds. If more than about half your lawn is dandelion and clover and plantain, treat it first and plan to seed a few weeks on. Outside those three, you can often just seed right over and let the new grass do the quiet work. Especially heading into fall, when the annual weeds are dying off anyway, and your grass gets a running head start on spring. And now the part that costs nothing at all, and it may just be the most valuable thing in this whole talk. You ready? Raise your mower. That's it. That's the whole tip. Raise the blade a notch or two and leave it there. Now let me tell you why it works so well, because it ties back to everything we've said. Remember, weed seeds need light on soil to wake up, so think about what a low cut really does. Scalp your lawn short, and you fling open the canopy. Sunlight pours down between the blades and lands on the dirt, and you've rolled out the welcome mat for every weed seed in the yard. But cut it a touch taller, and the grass shades its own soil. Those seeds never get the light they're waiting for, and they stay asleep. The good folks at Michigan State found that taller, denser grass casts a real shadow on the ground that holds down weed germination. Crabgrass most of all. And this isn't just my back porch opinion. There's a turf specialist named Lee Miller over at the University of Missouri, and he'll point you to more than 10 separate studies going all the way back to 1958. Study after study, decade after decade, finding the same thing. Mow below about 3.5 inches, and your dandelion and clover and crabgrass climb. Taller grass grows deeper roots, too, which means it drinks from further down, which means it holds up better through the dry heat of summer, which means it stays thick and closes more doors. It all compounds, season after season, quiet and steady. Most of us mow short because we think it looks tidy, and it means mowing a little less often. And all the while, without ever meaning to, we've been tending the weeds. Raising that deck a notch is free, takes 10 seconds, and lightens your weed load every single week for the rest of the year. Let's talk about water, because more new seed dies from watering wrong than from just about anything else. And it trips up folks who know better. Here's the thing to hold on to. Watering a seed is the opposite of watering a lawn. A grown lawn wants a deep soak, now and then, to pull its roots down. But a seed has no roots. It's sitting right up in the top half-inch of soil, and if that thin skin of soil dries out even once after the seed has woken up, that little seedling is gone. There's no bringing it back. So while you're waiting on your seed, do the reverse of your usual habit. Light and often. Just enough to keep that surface damp, a few times a day when it's warm. Never a flood, just a keeping moist. The folks at Iowa State say it plainly. Keep the seedbed moist with frequent, gentle watering, often more than once a day. Then, once the new grass is up and you've mowed it a couple of times, you switch over. Deep and infrequent, and you hold it there. That switch is what drives the roots down and gives you grass that lasts, instead of a shallow carpet that browns off the first hot week. And one small kindness. Stay off the seeded ground. New seedlings are tender little things, and footsteps across a sprouting patch will take out a surprising number of them. Give them room to find their feet. Now, about timing. If there's a blessed season for all of this, it's late summer into early fall. Iowa State will tell you why, and it matches what my own knees have learned over the years. The soil's still warm enough to sprout seed quickly. The brutal heat has broken, and fewer weed seeds are waking up to fight your grass for the space. Your new grass gets those soft, dewy weeks of fall to dig in, and then a running start come spring. Spring seeding can work, but fall is the gift. If you can wait for it, wait for it. So let me gather it all up for you, plain and in order, the way I'd tell it to a neighbor over the fence. First, take inventory. What's gone on to this lawn in the last few months? Any preventer, anything called weed and feed, and your seeding date is set by that, not by your wishes. Go read those bags. Next, figure out what you're actually fighting. The broadleaf weeds like dandelion and clover, the grassy ones like crabgrass, the creepers like ground ivy. They each ask for different handling and different patience. Then, if you're in one of those 3 hold-off cases, treat now and mark the calendar 4 to 6 weeks out, checking the label. After that, tend the ground. Aerate if the screwdriver says you're packed down, and rake away the dead mat so your seed can reach real dirt. Then choose your seed like it matters, because it does. Match it to your climate and to the grass you already have, and read the label for that weed number and that date. Seed in the fall window if you possibly can. Cover it. If you cover it, with clean peat moss or coir. Never the cheap dirt full of trouble. That's the $2 step. Water it light and often till it sprouts, then deep and seldom once it's up, and keep your feet off it. Raise your mower and keep it raised. And then plan to do it again next fall. Because here's a truth I'd rather you hear from me now than learn the hard way. A lawn that's gone mostly to weeds rarely comes all the way home in one season. One round will improve it. 2 rounds, across 2 falls, will transform it. Expecting a miracle in 6 weeks is exactly how good people give up right before it starts to work. So here's where I'll leave the heart of it. You almost certainly don't need to kill your lawn and start over from bare dirt. That's expensive, it's brutal on the back, and it leaves you with the most weed-friendly ground there is. Most lawns that look like a lost cause aren't lost at all. The grass isn't gone. It's just been crowded and outnumbered and squeezed out of its own space. What you need is the right order and $2 of the right cover instead of the wrong one. Find out what's already in your soil. Clear the weeds that block the seedlings. Loosen the ground. Seed in the fall. Cover it clean. Water it like a seed and not a lawn. And raise that mower. Do that 2 years running, and the lawn that once made you want to rent a tiller and start over will be the thickest, kindest patch of green on the whole street. And it'll stay that way. Because thick grass is the only weed control that never wears off, never needs buying again, and asks nothing of you once it's there. Now, before you go, I'd love to hear from you. I truly would. Tell me, down in the comments, what did the lawn or the garden look like where you grew up? Did your mother or your grandfather have a patch of ground they were proud of? Was there a trick they swore by? Some little bit of wisdom passed hand to hand down the years, the kind that never made it into any book? I'd love to gather those up in one place, where we can all learn from them. And tell me too, if you would, what's the one weed that rules your yard right now? Dandelion, clover, crabgrass, creeping Charlie, or something you can't quite put a name to. Because if enough of you name the same one, well, that's the very next talk we'll have together. Thank you for standing in the garden with me a while. Go easy on yourself, go easy on the lawn, and give it the season it needs. It'll come back to you. They always do, when we tend them right. I'll see you next time.